Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Fleck, and on behalf of the Attitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled A Parent's Guide to Understanding Depression in Teens. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Karen Swartz. Dr. Swartz is a professor of clinical psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. She is founder and director of the Adolescent Depression Awareness Program, which educates high school students, faculty, and parents about adolescent depression. More information about this program is available at www.adapeducation.org. Rates of teen depression, anxiety, loneliness, and mood disorders have increased dramatically since the start of the COVID pandemic. A new study has found that 20% of teens and adolescents had symptoms of major depressive disorder in 2021, but less than half received treatment for it. Signs of teen depression can be confounding for caregivers because depression can look like sadness or moodiness thanks to big hormonal swings and even co-occurring ADHD symptoms. In today's webinar, caregivers and teachers will learn how to identify teen depression and also about the support strategies that can help. We also have a special bonus for today's listeners. Attitude created a new download that explains symptoms of major depressive disorder in teens. It includes lots of tips for parents, and it's free. The link is in today's show notes. We'd like to begin today's webinar by asking this poll question to our live audience. How confident are you in your ability to differentiate between typical sadness and depression in teens? And what factors make it difficult for you to do so? Please select your answers and comment in the text box under the video player to tell us more. For answers to common webinar questions about slides, transcripts, and certificates of attendance, click on the FAQ tab of your webinar screen. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search podcast 477 to access the webinar resources, or simply click on the episode description wherever you stream your podcasts. If you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine. You won't want to miss our 25th anniversary winter issue. It's a special commemorative issue that examines how far we've come in our understanding of ADHD over the last 25 years, the role genetics plays, and what experts say we might expect in the future for diagnosis and treatment. Sign up for Attitude Magazine today for yourself or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Click the magazine tab on screen to learn more. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Karen Swartz. Thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this discussion.
Well, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here. It is so important that for those who are dealing with a young person with ADD, that they also have an understanding about mood disorders, both depression and bipolar disorder, because there is so much overlap. So today we're going to discuss the symptoms of depression in adolescence, how it presents, and as Carol was just saying, how it's different than just being upset, moody, or disappointed, the symptoms of bipolar disorder in adolescence, what the treatment options are for mood disorders, and the rates of co-occurring mood disorders and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And we'll end with what you can do if you're concerned about your child. So when you think about adolescence, teenagers have a lot of skills they need to master. They start thinking in more abstract ways. They start thinking about their life in perspective in the sense of not just what they're doing now, but what their future is going to be. They get, hopefully, new conflict resolution skills, so they're not just shoving each other in the playground like little kids. They're negotiating new relationships with adults, which parents often experience as a shove away, but they're trying to figure out how to become young adults rather than small children. They have very close relationships. This is where friends supplant parents as their favorite people. It's the time that young girls get BFFs and young men get girlfriends, and they become much more important than parents. And it's a time that their bodies are sexually maturing, and that brings a whole level of hormonal change, but also this priority in how do you manage this. So as I'm talking about depression, I want you to imagine having to do all of this with distorted thoughts, negative thinking, and with your confidence completely knocked down. So this is hard enough when you're well, and it is sometimes a really daunting task for young people that are dealing with depression or bipolar disorder. So think, what percent of young people do you think describe their adolescence as a time of severe emotional upheaval when they look back on it? And I ask this because there was a study that asked this question: was your adolescence a time of severe emotional upheaval? And they were asked in their mid-20s. So you're going back a decade and said, look back and you tell me. So think to yourself, what percent do you think it was? The thing that usually is shocking to parents is that the teenagers, the young adults, say 20%, which makes sense to me because it's actually 20% of young people that will have some sort of serious mental illness. So they can tell the difference between something serious and fighting with their parents. Now, when I asked parents, was it a time of severe emotional upheaval and turmoil? They're in the 100% range for them. But for the young people, they have the perspective. They know the difference between I fought with my mom and dad, or I had conflict with my teachers, and there was something really serious going on. They're not the same thing. These are older data, pre-pandemic, that showed that it was about 11% that had a mood disorder, 10% with some sort of behavioral disorder, and about 8% with anxiety disorders. These rates have essentially doubled with the pandemic, which is really concerning. We don't know if that'll be sustained, but at least now it's incredibly common for young people to be dealing with anxiety and depression. So if you look through development, we know there are different ages where disorders typically start. Not always, but typically. For example, it's pediatricians that are diagnosing autism. Many people that have attention deficit and other kind of disorders, that'll start when they're toddlers. Grade school and middle school are a time of anxiety, separation anxiety, generalized anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's also when Tourette's disorder begins. And then it's adolescence, high school, young adulthood, early college, where we have mood disorders, major depression, bipolar disorder, as well as emerging problems with substance use, and then other kinds of anxiety disorders, eating disorders, schizophrenia when they emerge. We think the timing of this relates to the developing brain. But today I'm going to talk about depression. And a question that so many parents have for me is, what's the difference between a moody teenager and someone going through depression? When we go into high schools and talk with them, we try to differentiate little d depression, which is a normal feeling of sadness everyone will have, from big D depression, a medical illness that has very particular symptoms. So it's like any other medical problem, there'll be a group of symptoms that come together and stay. If we look at those symptoms, they fall into three broad categories: mood changes, physical changes, and self-attitude changes. Now, when you're trying to differentiate being disappointed or upset, the key of that comparison is whether you have changes in how you feel about yourself. Teenagers have moods, especially with their developing bodies and the hormonal shifts. People can have different physical symptoms, as I'll talk about. Sometimes they're medically ill, et cetera. But this attacking your confidence and not feeling good about yourself, that's at the core of depression. So the mood changes can be sadness, feeling irritable, or feeling nothing, just sort of a lack of feeling. Interestingly, fewer than 50% of those who have depression, major depression, feel sad. So many feel nothing or feel irritable. And young people are most likely to report an irritability, an edgy irritability rather than sadness. And then the other part of the mood change is what we call anhedonia, where you lack the capacity for joy or pleasure. So no positive emotions. So experiencing negative emotions and changing your capacity, your ability to have positive emotions. The physical changes are all the things you see on a checklist at the doctor's. Changes in appetite and weight, which can go either up or down. It depends on the person. Sleeping more or less. Generally, people sleep less and they have trouble both falling asleep and then waking up throughout the night. So both difficulty falling asleep and then what we call early morning awakening. They generally feel slowed down and fatigued, but it can be punctuated by moments of feeling sort of restless and uncomfortable. And unfortunately, teenagers find that if they use substances, smoke marijuana, drink alcohol, that sort of edgy feeling can go away briefly. They are not treatments for mood because they worsen mood and they make the symptoms worse. But in a very short window, a half an hour, an hour, people will feel relief, which is why they're even more addictive. These substances are even more addictive for young people dealing with mood disorders in addition. And then concentration. Now that's independent of pre-existing problems with attention or attention problems from a condition like ADD or other issues. But it's everyone going through depression pretty much finds that their thoughts are slowed down, their thinking is slowed down, and their capacity for making decisions and processing information is reduced. Now, the self-attitude changes, which I mentioned before, are the core when you really say, I think this is depression. So lacking confidence. And so young people, it's what you care about. So young girls talk about changes in their appearance, being very critical of their appearance, being critical of whether others like them. Young boys are critical of their strength and whether they're a cool person that you'd want to be friends with. As people get older, it attacks different things. For example, at middle age, most women worry about being a bad mom. Most men talk about being a bad provider, and that's their worry. And then if you get to the point of my parents in their late 80s and early 90s, then people start talking about being a burden to their family. It's the same symptom over the age span. It's that you lose your confidence in the role you care about most. And in the most severe forms, that turns into feelings of guilt and worthlessness. As you can see how those really negative feelings link up to thoughts about death and thoughts about suicide. The sense of I'm not contributing, there's really no point of my being here. So when kids are very young, it's relatively rare to have major depression. It's 1 or 2%. And it's the same for boys and girls. It's at least 5% of adolescents and probably now closer to 10 that have major depression, not just some symptoms, but the whole syndrome. And there's a doubling of the rate for young women when they start getting their menstrual periods. And that continues through menopause. If you look at lifetime rates, it's at least 20% of women and 10% of men that have the kind of depression that's a medical problem. Not just some of the symptoms, but the entire syndrome, which makes it one of the most common conditions that we all are dealing with. Now, the symptoms that are different with teenagers, as I said before, having an irritable mood rather than sad, not enjoying things, feeling hopeless. When children are younger, they don't have that same view of the future. So hopelessness means I don't see my future. So you have to be thinking about it. And so that's why teens that are at particular risk of suicide, because they start getting very negative about their futures. Social isolation and dropping out of activities. Parents often say to me, my teenager doesn't want to go shopping with me or doesn't want to be out with me. And I say, right, because they're teenagers. They want to be with their friends. So I don't worry when people are more don't want to do things so much with their parents or their families at this age. But when they say, I don't want to go out with my friends, or I'd rather just stay home, that is really concerning. Substance abuse, as I mentioned, because sometimes it's how people feel better in the short term. Most teens get exposed at some point. And so if you are dealing with depression and you have that, I had a break from how awful I felt, you could see how it's much more appealing, unfortunately. Physical complaints, so headaches, stomach aches, those kinds of things. And then anxiety symptoms, where people are having worries about being away from family, having the onset of panic attacks with really intense anxiety or ongoing anxiety. So how long will a major depressive episode last? This is severe impairing depression. Typically in a teen untreated, it will last for 7 to 9 months. And given that an entire school year is 9 months, you can imagine that young people start thinking of themselves differently. I'm not a very good student. I'm not a very good athlete. I'm not very confident about that next step. Maybe I shouldn't try to be part of that activity or shouldn't try out for the team or the school play. So there's a trajectory that students will change in a really negative way because of depression changing their sense of confidence for a sustained period. It's not for a week or two. We can all recover from something that goes on for a week or two, but not months and months and months. So when adolescents are diagnosed with depression, 66% of them will have recurrent episodes. So the younger you have your first depression, the more likely it is to be recurrent. 10% will have episodes that are very long. 90% it's limited in the time, like I said, but about 10% will have these very long episodes that are very impairing. And about 20%, 5 to 10% will go on to develop bipolar type 1 disorder, and about 5 to 10% will go on to develop bipolar type 2. We're going to talk about bipolar disorder in just a moment, but the difference between 1 and 2 is that with bipolar 1, you have full manias, really dramatic, elevated moods. With bipolar 2, you can have very severe depression, but the elevation in mood is pretty mild. That's the difference. So with mania, it's the same 3 areas: mood changes, physical changes, and self-attitude changes. But as you can imagine with bipolar disorder, with the depression, you're low, and the mania, you're high. These changes are what you might expect. The mood changes, you get elevated, you're expansive. But if it gets really bad, people are often irritable. They often are annoyed that people can't keep up with them. And others are saying, look, you're not as smart as I am. You can't keep up with me and you're annoying me. So there's an edginess that often comes with mania. The physical symptoms are the opposite of depression. I don't need sleep. I'm going a mile a minute. I have so many thoughts, I want to share them. They're going really fast. I can't get anything done because I'm distracted. Now, both with the concentration problems of depression and the distractibility of mania, obviously this is a change from baseline for a mood disorder. A young person with the challenge of ADD may have that all the time. Now, it could worsen if they also have a mood disorder. But I'm talking about someone who's typically not distractible now being distractible, or the intensity and the impairment with the distractibility going up. So there's a baseline and then it gets worse for either depression or mania. The part of mania that's dangerous, obviously with major depression, the part that's dangerous is that it could lead to having suicidal thoughts. With mania, the dangerous part comes from someone not believing that there are limits. So they think they can do anything. They will do dangerous things. They might, in the most extreme thoughts, you might think you could fly or something and then do something really dangerous. But you go and engage in activities you would typically never do. And then the self-attitude change is that your confidence is too high. So you could imagine telling off your teacher or having an idea that you have such a great idea to make money or have an invention or something that you're going to drop out of school. So your good sense leaves you when you're manic. And so you make decisions that later typically you really regret. So bipolar disorder is 2 poles. So for bipolar disorder, manic symptoms are typically 3 symptoms for at least 1 week, whereas depressive symptoms are usually 5 symptoms for at least 2 weeks. In general, someone with bipolar disorder spends a lot more time in the depressive phase than in the manic phase, and the manias tend to be shorter. So your mood goes up and then unfortunately will crash into depression. So sometimes the elevated moods get missed, or they're misunderstood as someone, often young people have someone say, oh, you're using drugs, or it's something like that rather than something else. I want to make the point that with depression, there is typically an 8-year delay from having depressive symptoms start to actually getting treatment. Now, that seems unbelievable, doesn't it? There could be an 8-year delay. Well, the point of this is that it's not continuous. You don't have symptoms continuously that whole time. What you have is a period of symptoms, and then it goes away, and then it comes back, and then it goes away, and then it comes back. Because it's that kind of episodic illness, it will get missed. So a teenage episode gets written off to being teenage angst. And then maybe a college episode, people will party through it and say, oh, you were just partying too much. So it's later when someone wants to focus on raising their family, keeping their job, doing those things that they'll get into treatment. And with bipolar disorder, there's typically a 6-year delay. And so given those long delays, usually teenagers don't have these conditions identified, which is terrible because it interrupts their functioning and also interrupts their development. So, much less common. 20% of women, 10% of men have depression. It's only 1% that have bipolar 1. So when we think about ways to treat mood disorders, the core treatment is usually a combination of medication and psychotherapy. Now, for some individuals, it's psychotherapy alone. For others, it's primarily medication. That's very individualized, but almost every study that's looked at this has found that the combination is far superior to either one alone. And part of that is that you need to learn about yourself and how to manage symptoms you have, how to recognize them, and what it means to have a serious medical problem. You know, young people, thankfully, are usually pretty healthy. Or if you're already dealing with one challenge, there'll be a resentment saying, I don't want to have another thing. I don't want to have to deal with a second thing. And so sometimes people will not be open to that. Now, in addition to these treatments, it's actually important to include education and support so people understand what they have and how they're going to manage it. Family involvement is critical, as is interrupting other behaviors like substance use, eating disorder behavior, cutting, those kinds of things, because they destabilize moods. And then other things like mindfulness meditation, relaxation techniques. This time of year when the days are getting shorter, I think too about bright light therapy, which can be helpful for some. If we look at cognitive behavioral therapy, I'm going to just mention that as one form of psychotherapy. The theory behind it is that if you can challenge the distorted thoughts you have, you'll be able to feel better. Now, both depression and bipolar disorder, the manic episodes, significantly distort your thoughts. They get you to think the most negative version of everything. So you have an interaction with your friends, you're going to say, oh, I can tell they're mad at me, based on nothing. You have an interaction with the teacher or parents or family, your instinct is going to take the most negative view of what happened. And so the goal with cognitive behavioral therapy is to work to change your behaviors, but also the problematic thoughts you have. It's been very well studied and shown to be very effective for depression and anxiety disorders in teens and in adults. And the idea of CBT comes from this idea that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all interacting. And so CBT focuses on challenging the negative thoughts and changing behaviors. So when you don't feel like getting out of bed, you don't. When you feel like drinking instead of doing something else, you do. Changing to more positive behaviors and also challenging the negative ideas with the thought, and I can tell you from experience, demonstrated benefit of actually changing feelings by targeting thoughts and behaviors because they're all interactive. As far as medications, I'll just mention antidepressants as the core treatment for both depression and serious anxiety problems. The group that are used most frequently for young people are the SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. I have Prozac and Lexapro in gold because those are the two specifically approved for the treatment of depression in those under 18. However, they've all been approved for the treatment of anxiety disorders too. So we're not limited for only those two. Another group that's used fairly commonly in young people are the SNRIs, or serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. Those are medicines like Effexor and Cymbalta and Prestige. There are others, Wellbutrin, Remeron, et cetera. I will make the point that that Wellbutrin is the one antidepressant that doesn't also have effectiveness for anxiety. So if young people have the mix, that is sometimes what we don't use. However, it is an antidepressant that is sometimes used in the treatment of attention deficit symptoms. So sometimes if a young person is dealing with both, that could be an excellent choice if you're trying to minimize the number of medications. Tricyclics are an older group that we typically don't use as frequently in teens unless other things haven't been effective, but they're still excellent. And monoamine oxidase inhibitors are also an older group that we tend to not use in teens. We tend to reserve those for the individuals where many things have not worked because there are potential drug interactions and interactions with food that are, they have to be very careful. And sometimes impulsive teenagers are not able to be careful in the way that they need to be. For the treatment of bipolar disorder, lithium and then anticonvulsants, so medicines typically used to treat seizure disorders, are the core treatments. So those include things like Depakote, Tegretol, Lamictal, Trileptal. Lithium has the strongest and longest evidence, but there are also good options. And then when young people are very acutely manic, they're often also treated with medications, which we call neuroleptics, atypical neuroleptics, like risperidone or Zyprexa. Now, in addition to medication, psychotherapy, young people are going to be healthier if they can engage in other healthy behaviors. I talk to the people I work with about whether something is good for your mood or bad for your mood. And you can think about that. Almost everything we do, we know it's either going to be good for us or bad for us. But there are certain things that are particularly important if you are dealing with a mood disorder. So getting enough sleep. I cannot emphasize that. And unfortunately, the schedules that our young people have make it really hard to do that. Getting enough exercise, eating something healthy, not drinking, using drugs, spending time with family and friends, and following some kind of a schedule. So those all contribute in a good way. We know from this study that was done in New Zealand, where they were not treating, they were just following young people from birth. So it's a long cohort study. And when the young people were around 15, they went about every 5 years. They checked to see if they had depression or not. And then they went back, and at 10 years after the initial assessment, they were comparing how the young people did that had depression as a teenager and those who did not have depression. Since most of them did not get treatment, again, this was a study done by sociologists, not psychiatrists. This is what we know. Having adolescent depression puts you at higher risk of having recurrent depression, not surprising, anxiety disorders, substance dependence or abuse, making suicide attempts, not going as far in school as would have been predicted from your earlier performance, either fathering a child or having a child at a young age, and being unemployed. Now, I will say that I talk about this study with parents when they're reluctant for their child to have care because you can just say, this is not what anyone wants for a young person. Depression interrupts your ability to function, so it interrupts your ability to go forward in a positive way. So what are some misconceptions about mood disorders? Well, one is it's a sign of weakness. That's just preposterous. The people that are able to live with these conditions are some of the strongest people I've ever met in my life. That antidepressants are addictive, which is just medically wrong. That you can just decide not to be depressed. You can just get your attitude adjusted and that will work. It's kind of like telling someone in the middle of an asthma attack to take some deep breaths and it'll go away. That it's always due to circumstance. It's true that life stresses can worsen depression and trigger episodes, but it's also true that sometimes they come out of the blue. And that it only involves a change in mood. Often the cognitive changes, the distorted thinking, the slowed thinking are some of the things that make, or with mania, the sped up thinking and the bad judgment are the symptoms that cause the most trouble rather than the mood symptoms. Now, when I talk to parents, I hear two kinds of myths. First, there's the maximizing fault myth. This is terrible that I missed it. This is terrible because it is in my family, which is, the guilt of genetics, or blaming the other parent, which is, as you can imagine, the least productive of all of them. This is all your fault because you did X or Y or Z. But unfortunately, there's also the myths of it's a phase, they'll be over it soon. It's a reaction to the divorce, to our moving, to the grandparent dying, or it can be overcome by willpower. The difference with depression, of course, compared to a reaction or a phase is that it sustains. Reactions are usually short-lived. Depression is typically sustained and gets sustained in a way that it ends up being impairing. So importantly for today, as we're talking with parents who are very savvy and aware of how things go together with attention deficit, I just wanted to share results from one recent, very well done meta-analysis where they put together multiple studies looking at how common ADD and mood disorders are. So we just look at whether they're common. 40 to 70% of the time, a young person with depression or bipolar disorder will have a second condition. That is not fair, but it is factual. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder being one of the most common, anxiety disorders and substance use also being very common. So if we look at the numbers, this is this meta-analysis that put together multiple studies. And what do we find? That if you have childhood onset bipolar, so that's child BD, about 70% of those young people will also have attention deficit. If you have childhood onset major depression, then it's more in the about 35%. If you have the onset of bipolar disorder as an adolescent, then you're at about 45% that will also have ADD. Adolescent onset major depression, it's about 20%. And then if you have the first symptoms of bipolar disorder or major depression as an adult, it's lower. But these are incredibly high co-occurring rates. The other, I think, very helpful figure they did was looking at ADHD prevalence, the estimate of that, and comparing for both bipolar disorder on the top and depression below. There are these two different graphs. They looked at in the red, the rates in North America, and in the aqua, it's the rates in other parts of the world. So it shows that, especially for bipolar disorder, there are higher rates here in the US, but they're pretty significant everywhere. And then with depression, it's less of a difference in that, for example, for adolescent onset depression, the co-occurring rate of ADD is actually higher in other parts of the world. But if you just take the average, we're looking at 70% of youth that have onset of bipolar disorder when they're young, less than, when they're in middle school, say, are going to also be dealing with ADD. If you have the onset of bipolar disorder or major depression, either as a child and adolescent, there's a very high percent chance that you're dealing with both, which of course contributes to complexity in treatment. And we have to think about that. Just to share something with you, for 25 years, I've been running a program where we go into schools to teach kids about depression. So I feel like I have heard from doing 25 years of parent nights what parents are really worried about. And so I'm just sharing the resource that was mentioned in the introduction, adapeducation.org, where there are a series of webinars that are available for free and also more information for parents and students. So just to offer that as a resource. So to conclude, talking about attention deficit and mood disorders. Mood disorders are very common in adolescence. It's one of the most common psychiatric problems adolescents face. Suicide, unfortunately, can be a major cause of death, and so you want to take it very seriously. And attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and mood disorders commonly co-occur. So you have to think about that. These are two conditions that come together. And having the onset of attention deficit when you're younger, parents want to be on the lookout for the development of either anxiety disorders or mood disorders because there are very high co-occurring rates of all three of those. But mood disorders are treatable. That the reason to know about this and distinguish them is so that you cannot miss something that could actually be really helpful for your child. And sometimes people will say, well, one thing's enough. It's like, well, not if the young person has two, because the same treatments, the primary treatments for attention deficit obviously are the stimulants primarily. They don't hurt major depression. Sometimes they're an adjunct treatment, but they're not a primary treatment. And with bipolar disorder, it complicates treatment because the stimulants actually can, for some, trigger mood cycling. And certainly in those who are not being treated with a mood stabilizing medicine can definitely trigger mood cycling. So things that you have to think about. So as a parent, what can you do to support your child? Well, if you're concerned, talk to your child about those concerns and have a conversation that's not superficial. Now, I do understand that this is not an easy thing to do with someone who is a teenager because their response to many things is fine. And fine. The day was fine. What are you talking about? But if you have specific things you're observing, I've noticed you haven't been out with your friends much, or I've been concerned that you've seen, not quite yourself. That's an opportunity. Really importantly is to always be talking about mental health concerns seriously and respectfully. If you've made disparaging comments or made fun of people, not that hopefully anyone is doing this, but we know some people do, then they're going to think that they shouldn't have that or it means something terrible about them if you have those kind of conditions. And consider an evaluation. One other thing I'll add is that if you're not sure, often getting in touch with the school counselor who can, in a thoughtful way, maybe get a little information. When people have depression, it's not just at home because they're having arguments with their parents. It's affecting their interactions with peers, with their academics, with their activities, be they sports or other activities at school, as well as how they're feeling about themselves. So often that's an opportunity to find out what's going on at the 8 hours a day they're not around you or not at home, which can be really helpful information sometimes. Okay, and with that, we'll take questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Swartz. Really appreciate that important information. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to share the final results from today's poll question. How confident are you in your ability to differentiate between typical sadness and depression in teens, and what factors make it difficult for you to do so? Here's what you said. 43% said somewhat confident, 32% said they weren't sure, 16% said not very confident. And the factors that made it difficult to discern teen depression symptoms, 35% said onset of puberty and mood shifts, 23% said look-alike ADHD symptoms, 20% said lack of communication from their child, 14% said impact of the pandemic. Now to your questions. How can we help a teen who resists getting help, such as going to therapy or taking medication?
So that is a huge challenge, right? When children are very young, they'll typically do what their parents say. As they get older, they have more agency and they have much stronger opinions. And so I think if someone's saying, I'm not going to do this, rather than having infinite conversations, having some other trusted adults be part of the conversation can be helpful, whether that's a pediatrician, a counselor at school, a coach, someone else in addition. Not that the parent shouldn't start, of course you should, they're your child, but getting some others involved. And I also think it's important to be able to share with them what you expect to get better. Not just, look, I think you have this, you need to do this treatment, but identify the symptoms that are most problematic to them and say, I know you haven't been able to enjoy yourself, or I know you're having trouble thinking. I really think this is going to help change that. A line I've used with my own friends and family who have been resistant to getting treatment is to say that I think you're suffering when you don't need to. I just don't want to see you suffer when you don't need to. But the main thing is to not have any thought that you're going to have one conversation and go forward. If you're that lucky, I'm thrilled for you. Typically, you have to have multiple conversations and even bring in other really trusted adults. You don't want to get random people because then they'll be angry that you're sharing their private business. But if they have a really trusted coach, really trusted teacher, someone in the community that they're part of an organization, someone like that might be helpful to include too sometimes.
Someone asked, what are triggers for depression for school-age children, and is it possible for depression to be prevented?
Sure. So prevention, we're not sure about. What I can tell you is that depression's like other medical problems. If you think about something really common for young people, asthma. Sometimes asthma comes out of the blue. Sometimes it's because you cleaned out your grandmother's dusty attic. Sometimes it's because you visited your friend with 3 cats. We don't treat it differently if it's out of the blue or from the cats. We don't say out of the blue, you get an inhaler, and the cat, you should have known better, you don't get an inhaler, right? We say you're having an asthma attack, we're going to treat it. So there are certainly life stressors and triggers, including hormonal changes and a major stress, major losses, the loss of a parent, God forbid, or the loss of a grandparent. But sometimes it comes out of the blue. The tricky part is that, yes, those things could trigger it, but also if you're depressed, your reaction to things that happen in life gets way out of proportion. So often people will say to me, well, I think this is all because that girl broke up with him. I'll say, well, I think from speaking with him that the depression started before, so his reaction to that was out of the blue. So if you said, well, what are some things I could do that maybe would help? We don't know a surefire way to prevent, but having young people not smoke pot, not drink alcohol, and get enough sleep are pretty basic things that could be helpful. And they're also really, really challenging things to achieve.
Mm-hmm. A parent asks, what are the less obvious signs of depression that often go unnoticed by parents?
Right. So the parallel to ADD is that, obviously a person who is, to quote one of my teachers, wiggly and squiggly and calling out and getting in trouble, you might not miss that. But if you have the inattentive type, so the big thing is, who is the person? So depression is a change. People don't have this from such a young age. They're going along and then there's a clear change. But the change is subtle and gradual. So each day isn't that different day to day. And so there's a subset of young people where it's really subtle, quieter, more introverted, maybe not so much social or interacting. So if they get a little more socially withdrawn, well, they were never that social. And I will tell you, the pandemic screwed that up because we changed how kids were interacting. But subtle kinds of things are very subtle changes in confidence. No one's saying I'm a terrible person or I don't think you care about me, but they're saying, I apologize, being at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, there's an ambulance going down the street. There are these subtle things like, I don't think I would get a part in the play, so maybe I won't try. Or it's a lot of work to spend time with my friends, so maybe I'll just stay home. So those are some things that are more subtle. Someone looking miserable and talking about what a terrible person they are. Parents are not going to miss that. At these quieter ones. But the bigger problem is that it changes so slowly that it might take 2 months for it to get really bad. And each day is not that different than the day before, so you might miss it. Unlike getting sick with the flu or COVID, where you're fine and then you feel really awful, and then you sort of get better over time.
Is it better to treat depression and ADHD together or focus on one condition first before the other?
I'm biased. I think it's best to treat both because if you don't treat, say you treat the depression, ignore the ADD, that's a stress. I'm not able to focus and concentrate, and that's causing me difficulty. If you treat the ADD without the depression, your concentration may be significantly impaired by the depression. And so you're treating, you're in that way, over treating or escalating the dose of the medication or other treatments for ADD. So I think it's best to have a plan where you're working on both. Now, you might say, let's start one medicine and make sure that it agrees with the person, or one kind of therapy with a focus, and then add. But I wouldn't wait a long time. Let's get this done and give it 6 months and we'll see. That would not be my recommendation.
I love this next question. How can students best support a classmate who may be experiencing periodic or persistent depression?
That's a fantastic question. So many people talk about the fact that when they have depression, they feel like they can't share it because it's personal or that people don't understand. So what do we do for our friends if they're going through something? We take them to lunch. We suggest they come over. We say, why don't we watch a movie? So what's great is for friends to reach out, but also to suggest things they can do together that won't be stressful. So going to a big party when you're feeling depressed is overwhelming. Instead of saying, why don't you come over and we'll get a pizza and we'll watch a movie? So something quieter, but just showing that you're okay spending time together and that you want to spend time together, I think is really important. At the same time, I just want to add, I think it's important that we give young people the message, and we do this with our high school project, they shouldn't be trying to be their friend's therapist. If they're worried about their friend, they need to share that with their own parent or their friend's parent, because they shouldn't be in the position of trying to provide that level of support. Mm-hmm. They should be watching a movie and eating a pizza.
The flip side of that question is, how can I help my teen who has no friends?
Sure. So when you have no friends, think about it. It's when people have to move, they'll say, I'm moving to a new city. What the heck am I going to do? I'll say, well, think about something you like to do, because often a good way to make friends is with an activity base, right? So maybe you don't click with the people at your school, or you get involved with the school play, or you help to make the scenery for it or something, but you start doing things with other students, or you get involved with, a community group that's doing certain things. And so, you're helping to clean up the bay here in Maryland, but you're out and interacting with people. And if you have a shared interest, then you often have something to talk about. For young people who are very shy, or maybe have had, it's more challenging because of the challenges they've had to face. Sometimes that's a way to start.
Okay. How does depression affect a student's academic performance?
Sure. So academic performance with depression is classically impaired. Now, sometimes I've had young people tell me that their freedom was based on their grades, what they're allowed to do. So sometimes grades will be okay, but what you'll find is that students start limiting everything else. They're not playing soccer anymore. They didn't try out for the play. And you'll ask them why, and they'll say, look, it's taking me 3 or 4 times longer than usual to do my homework. I can't process. I have to reread things. I can't think as quickly, but I know I'll be in trouble if my grades go down. So typically there will be a drop in grades because of concentration, that you really just can't process information. But occasionally kids will keep them up, but the effort they have to put into doing it goes way up.
A parent asks, are there school accommodations for depression?
Absolutely. Now, obviously, all school accommodations are on an individual basis, but I've been part of organizing that for students. And I think that in general, the schools have gotten a little more sophisticated about this. There is nothing good about COVID and what that did across the world, but it has opened people's eyes a little bit to the fact that some of these psychiatric issues are real and that we have to be more serious about them. And they often are things related to time, because if you're not processing quickly, it might take you more time, or some, ability to delay turning things in and stuff like that. The typical kind of accommodations.
Mm-hmm. How can I help my college student who has depression but who lives away at school?
So sometimes college students were getting treatment at home with the great support of parents reminding them about medicines and things. And then they go to college and then they think antidepressant or beer. And they pick beer, which isn't good. And then things fall apart. Almost every college has a counseling center, which is a good place to start because they can do an evaluation and then often link the college student to local services and local support. Some colleges have support groups. Others at least can get you connected with what local resources are. So it's a trusted place to start when you're just trying to look for resources in other places.
If my teen with ADHD has had a depression episode with suicidal thoughts, is it likely that he will have another episode like that?
It's very interesting and challenging because when you've had a really serious depression, like you're describing, there are three possibilities. One is that you'll never have another one. The other possibility is you'll have another one, but it won't be for years, like 10 or 15. And the other is that another episode will come relatively quickly, especially if you don't stay on medicine. The problem is we have no way of predicting, which is why if someone is doing well and not having bad side effects, we ask people to be really thoughtful if they've responded to treatment about stopping that treatment. So it's a little bit of a stress test to figure out which group you're in. Now, there is some data that supports that if you had that first episode when you're young, it's more likely that you'll have recurrent episodes. But not everyone does. Some people are very lucky and just have one. But if you were just looking at the likelihood, the odds of it, the odds if you had a very serious episode when you were younger, you will have other episodes in the future, which sometimes you can prevent by staying in treatment and staying, continuing to do the psychotherapy, continuing medications.
Someone asked, if depression is under control, will this prevent bipolar onset?
There's no real study that's ever looked at that, as you can imagine. The thing with bipolar disorder, what we think is that every one of us is born with different biologic vulnerability to depression, to ADD, to bipolar disorder, to all of these different conditions. And you can't know. But we do think that life matters. And let me share this with you. If you look at identical twins that have exactly the same genetics, right? If one twin has bipolar disorder, it's only 50% of the time that the other twin also has it. So then you say, okay, what were the differences? So things like exposure to drugs and alcohol, sleep disruptions, maybe other medical conditions, they all come into it. There are all these factors in life that maybe triggers it for one person and not another. But certainly having well-controlled depression is it's certainly a positive thing in the way these other things are positive things. So it's not a guarantee, because we also don't know whether that young person was vulnerable or not at all. I mean, the majority of young people that have depression will not have bipolar disorder. It's 10 to 20% that later go on to develop bipolar disorder, but it's 80 to 90% that do not.
Someone asked, what are some early identifiable symptoms that are unique to teens with bipolar?
So with bipolar disorder, there's I've said to many young people, it's like, you get really imperious and impatient and annoyed with everyone. But it's not just, parents. It's there's an edge to it. I'm smarter than you and you can't keep up with me. And then the other things you might observe are the changes in need for sleep and the amount of activity someone's involved with before it perhaps progresses to the point that's really worrisome. So need for sleep, amount of sort of buzzing activity going on, and this sort of, I'm annoyed with everyone because they can't keep up with me. I would say those are some subtle things we often see earlier than the more dramatic symptoms, like I think I have I'm disorganized and I think I have special talents or abilities.
Someone asked, how much of an impact do you think social media has, such as TikTok and Instagram, on an adolescent's perceptions and beliefs that they're depressed?
It's hard to know because on one level, you want people to learn and identify it. I mean, I've been going to schools for 25 years for a reason. I want young people to have information about this, the way I want them to have information about smoking and lung cancer and other kinds of medical things and the kind of things that a healthy diet is good for your long-term health, all of that. There are probably some people that decide they have depression when they don't because of TikTok. I know there are some people that identify symptoms they might not have known about because of TikTok. My worry is not so much the sort of public service things. My worry is someone getting sucked into very negative parts of all of that, where they're comparing themselves to others negatively, where they spend... Nobody has the life that they have posted on Facebook or Instagram or any of it, right? No one says, look how messy my kitchen is. What a disaster. Everyone is curating, they're choosing, they're putting forward something that's unrealistic. And now these young people are, throwing up filters and this and that. And so it's not even realistic. And I think different young people have different levels of sophistication about whether they should believe anything they see on the internet. And so overall, it is greatly, the actual sort of being and interacting in social media, I think has real potential, real negative potential. Maybe there are some groups, very marginalized groups, in some studies have been shown to find community and support. So it's not all bad, but it's a lot bad.
Yeah. Someone writes, how can I find a balance between supporting my child without being a helicopter parent and giving him space?
Yeah, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't how involved should I be? I think part of it is when you're trying to decide how involved to be, should be how well they're functioning, right? I think you can reward reasonable behavior and reasonable and good choices with less helicoptering. To say, look, if you're able to do the following things and I don't have to remind you, then I know I can trust you. So setting up opportunities for young people to thrive and incentivizing. I'll take care of this, I'll take care of that. I think of a friend of mine whose mother was forever showing up at the high school with whatever he didn't bring with him and fussing at him and everything else. And it's like, well, why don't you just work on remembering your lunch? It's like, I don't have to. My mom will do it. And I remember thinking in high school, I remember thinking, that is messed up. Is your mom going to college with you? So I think setting it up where you can incentivize the kind of independence that people would like and might be good for them would be great.
Yeah. And someone asks, if bipolar symptoms are treated early in life, would that help prevent more severe issues later in life?
There haven't been formal studies of this because you can imagine you can't say, let's take the group and we'll treat you and let's take a group and we don't treat you. But from my personal experience of being a psychiatrist focusing on mood for almost 30 years, the earlier you identify and treat, the less chaos it creates. It doesn't interrupt. I said that there's this long delay for many people. In that time, many people get caught up in substance use, eating disorders, other kind of problematic behaviors, but also problematic relationships. And so the earlier you can identify and treat, I think the better outcomes, without question, because it gets managed instead of taking over.
Okay. And then our last question is, how do you get a child to open up about their feelings without making them seem uncomfortable?
That is another $1 million question.
Yes.
So if someone figures that out, please share it with everyone. I mean, I think a way that can help is to routinely have opportunities. That you say, we're all having dinner together and we're going to sit here and I'm going to talk about my day and you're going to talk about your day, even if you think it's silly. But if you as a family routinely, and I don't mean every night necessarily, sometimes kids have activities, parents have activities, but if regularly you're interacting, then they're used to interacting with you. So it's not that you're marching into their room when you're worried and saying, what is going on? Right? Then you feel like you're the investigator as opposed to someone's different in the discussion you have, say, at dinner. And you can say, well, I just want to ask you another question. Everyone leaves like, I just have a question for you. Okay. But you're used to having interactions. I think that can help a lot.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Swartz, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your expertise with our ADHD community. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the invitation to join you all today.
And thank you to today's listeners. We hope to see you again next week. Make sure you don't miss future Attitude webinars, articles, or research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at attitudemag.com/newsletters. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search podcast 477 to access the webinar resources, or simply click on the episode description wherever you stream your podcasts. If you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine. Sign up for Attitude Magazine today for yourself or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.
It's time to get down to business with $30 a month business internet. Wow Business offers 99.9% network reliability so that you can keep your business moving. $30 a month gets you 30 megabytes per second with 24/7 US-based support, a price lock guarantee, and a 60-day satisfaction guarantee. Lock in our lowest priced offer for the support you need. Go to switchtowowbusiness.com. Offer for new customers with a 2-year agreement subject to change. Prices do not include taxes, fees, and equipment charges. Restrictions apply.